We're here for the fourth and final episode of Salvation South series called 50 Years of Ferris. And in that, we've been revisiting four documentary films by the folklorist Bill Ferris that were released 50 years ago in 1975. And today we're going to be talking about a film called I Ain't Lying. Welcome back, Bill Ferris. We're glad you're here.
Thank you, Chuck. It's really an honor to be with you.
Well, I've been enjoying these conversations so much, and I'm honestly I'm a little bit sad that this is the last in the series. We're going to have to find other excuses to get together and talk.
Well, I'll be a partner in crime when you try to do that.
Let's talk about I Ain't Lying specifically. You know, the film, it really sort of captures a really broad spectrum of the black oral tradition in Mississippi. From anecdotes about church to all the way to the dirty dozens, as your subjects refer to it. I'm curious. How did you decide what stories to include?
We really tried to pick the best of a broad range of oral tradition, from the classic animal stories, animal tales like Brer Wolf, Brer Rabbit, that are African in origin. And many of these are trickster tales where a weaker adversary uses their head to outwit a stronger adversary. And we had many choices, and we tried to pick a sampling from different ages and different backgrounds that we felt would be appropriate and would keep it moving in a dramatic way, which storytelling does.
Well, those, the trickster tales that you mentioned, are something that I learned about several years ago. And when you look at the anthropological work that Zora Neale Hurston did, those things often come up, and they were stories, that allowed enslaved people to envision getting the upper hand on the people who enslaved them through trickery.
Right,
Is that
right.
a fairly correct summation of that?
Absolutely. And that runs all the way to the present. There are a lot of trickster stories set in the legal worlds with a judge. Here comes the judge,
Right, right.
where a poor black person is facing the judge, and he outwits the judge, and the judge lets him go
Right,
free by using his wit.
right.
So the trickster runs the gamut from slavery right up to the present.
What did those story forms tell you about the priorities and survival strategies of that community in Leland, Mississippi?
I think they are a shield against oppression, against violence, and they lace the narrative with humor and drama. And you have recognized storytellers who are known for their gifts,
Hmm.
like Shelby Papa Jazz Brown, who was the patriarch of blues and stories in Kent's Alley in Leland, where he lived, and had a house party every Saturday night with blues singer James Sunford Thomas. But when he told a story, everyone listened because it was like theater. It was dramatic, it was funny, it had all the elements of keeping you on the edge of your seat, wondering what was going to come next, and it was never disappointing.
The people in I Ain't Lying, as you said earlier, they don't just tell stories; they perform them, right? And how did you think about how you, as the filmmaker, you as the documentarian, balanced observation with intervention, right? Especially since, I mean, anytime someone goes into a room with a camera, it can change how people speak and behave.
Well, it's true, but in the context of the story, theater trumps the camera every time. And a good storyteller, people may notice you when you come in, but when the story gets started, they're much more interested in that. And their focus moves right away from you to the storyteller. And Papa Jazz is a good example of all of these storytellers. In many ways, the story reflects the life around them. There's so much connection. It could have happened. Maybe it didn't happen. Maybe it's a story that's passed down. But the telling of that story fits so neatly like a glove on a hand. It works, and you're listening with rapt attention as it unfolds. And I said earlier that I saw this work as a political
Mm-hmm.
act to capture the voices of people who were so close to the life of the Mississippi Delta Black
Mm-hmm.
experience. They embodied it like fine wine in a jar. This story contains the essence of what it's like to be Black and to survive in a world that's so hostile and unforgiving.
You know, the film sort of oscillates across a pretty broad spectrum. I mean, you get really sharp humor on the one hand, and you get really deep hardship described on the other. There's graveyard tales, and then there's baptism jokes, and there's songs about depression and oppression. And I I, I got curious when I was watching it. It became really clear watching I Ain't Lying how huge and important a role humor played in that community.
It's true. And it's often a sort of dark
Yes.
humor, the baptism where the person being baptized says, I don't like that thing behind you. And the minister thinks that's fear of baptism. And he says, don't be afraid, come on to the water. Well, eventually it becomes clear that what he doesn't like behind the minister is an alligator swimming toward him. So the minister looks up and sees the alligator. He says, I don't like it either. And they both run out of the water. Well, that's, it's a sense of humor at work, but it's also a grim reality that if you're being
Yeah.
baptized in a pond, sometimes there is an alligator in there, and you better be very careful, or
Hmm.
snakes. You're living in a hostile environment, and you have to mix religion with caution.
Well, there's this phrase that you use in the brief pieces of narration that you have in the film, uh, the dozens. And that's something that's going to be familiar to some people watching our conversation. It won't be familiar to some people. So, could you take a second and describe the dozens?
The dozens are a competition, a verbal competition, usually between two teenage males. It's a sort of coming of age ritual to play the dozens. And you play them, you each have a chance to have a two-line rhyme about the other person's mother, sister, grandmother, aunt. It's targeting the women in the other person's family. And that can go on for 5 minutes or 15 minutes, however long Each person can continue to come up with dozens until they run out. And then when they run out, they lose. And the other person has dozens to say, I beat you. But it's a very obscene. Uh, but if the other person's mother or sister are ill or have died or whatever, then they don't play it. It's not intended to be taken personally. It's a sort of ritual of verbal competition. And it's very fast and very dramatic.
It's interesting because you look at the span of time between 1975, when this film came out, and where we are 50 years later, and you see the dozens taking the form of the rap battle.
It's true. Uh, and there's a phrase, yo mama. And when that is said, it sets everything off because it's a kind of shorthand for the dozens, which are about your mama. But all that's needed in conversation, just as an aside, is say your mama, and everyone is focused on what it is you're talking about because the dozens are deeply embedded in the teenage oral tradition. We have a constant wellspring of oral tradition coming out of the Black voices like those in these films that continue today and feed not only pop culture but literary tradition.
Mm.
Authors like Alice Walker, Ernest Gaines. The the oral tradition is the wellspring for literature as well.
The National Book Award winner for fiction last year was James, a book written by a black storyteller born in the South, now lives in California, Percival Everett, which is the Huckleberry Finn story told from Jim's point of view. And it's interesting how all of that shifts and changes, and how things you were documenting 50 years ago become context points for modern storytelling.
James is a beautiful counterpoint to the adventures of Huckleberry Finn. And the point of both novels is that language is where it's all founded. And when James shifts between the stereotypical language of Jim, sort of shucking and jiving, to highly eloquent, educated uh, voice, it shows that he has both command of both of these, which is what the great writers uh, in both cases of these
Mm-hmm.
two novels have. They're able to move from the oral tradition to the literary tradition and to merge these voices in ways that are extraordinarily powerful.
We to go back to this idea of American culture really being black culture. Why do you think that there's still many people who just refuse to acknowledge that debt?
Well, I think people, sadly, uh, racism is a factor. And white racism is a refusal to acknowledge the power and beauty of the black voice. And it's around us everywhere. The music, the voices of spoken word, of art, everywhere we turn in our lives today, Black America has made it a softer, more powerful voice. And internationally, people all over the world, when they think of music, 20th century music, Louis Armstrong, B.B. King, Mahalia Jackson, Aretha Franklin. The list goes on. These are the icons of modern music. They happen to be all black. They don't just happen to be. There's a reason for that. And so it's not simply in America, it's all over the world that people acknowledge the power and richness and the fact that they are American. We think of American music or modern music, uh, then you have to say that the black voice is front and center.
And let's take this discussion over into the area of gender because you have Papa Jazz talking about learning the blues from the women, right, in the film, and you have the dozens which are based on these humorous put downs of women in the culture, but at the same time in the film you have Amanda Gordon there who's like essentially doing a takedown of a preacher, right? And treating the preacher who stands at the front of the church with the same humorous takedowns that the men in Papa Jazz's house are taking down the women when they do the dozens.
That's right. Mary Gordon has this, it's a hymn, basically, in terms of the
Mm-hmm.
structure. So it fits a religious uh, song about a preacher who turns out to be basically someone who is breaking all the rules, trying to seduce a member of the
Mm-hmm.
congregation. And there is a sort of trope in the black community that the preachers are interested in two things: women and fried chicken. They like a good meal and they
Yeah.
like women. And that is a common denominator that people identify with. But she creates this ironic hymn that is about a preacher who's breaking those rules. And she finally drives him out of her house and says, "Don't come back again."
You see characters recur in the various films, right? But it wasn't until I got to uh, the storytelling film, to I Ain't Lying, that, I got to see sort of a full spectrum of, everything from the sacred to the profane, right? And, it's clear to me and that have a deep love and affection for the people you filmed when you were, in your teens and 20s and early 30s. I know you must have had a desire to make sure that the people you had filmed were portrayed in the best light. But in this film, you have them saying some things that are distinctly profane. And, I wonder if you ever hesitated about including those moments.
Uh, I've always viewed film as the ultimate
Hmm.
truth teller, and you simply point and shoot, and whatever happens is like a photograph. You don't always know what's in there until you develop it. And in the film, I wanted to capture the whole range of truth, of humor, of sadness. And the profane, to me, is a welcome, celebratory voice. And you have profanity in both white and black folklore. Uh, the old mule trader, white mule trader
Hmm.
Ray Lum, had a number of verses that he would use with his work of trading and auctioning livestock that were just as profane as anything in the film, but they were from a different tradition. Irish verses, I would think, is probably where they came from. They were old, about women, about animals, uh, and you find that in both traditions. And you go back to Chaucer, the wife of Bath. There's a lot of profanity in the early old tradition of English language, and it's in African voices and in the black voices in this country. And to me, it's refreshing. The four-letter
Hmm.
words uh, are some of the richest in our language. And so when that emerges, I embrace it with great pleasure. And it's a welcome part of the spectrum of Black oral tradition.
Watching I Ain't Lying, I become conscious of two ideas having to do with the passage of time since the film was released. And one is that the storytelling traditions endure, of course, but the second is that the conditions that provide the context for the stories that are told have changed dramatically. I mean, the role of agriculture in Mississippi's rural economies has declined dramatically. More people are now working in manufacturing and service jobs, and secondly, digital technology now exists. And I'm curious about what you hear from your students and other aspiring folklorists, both about how the subject matter of the stories might have changed, and also about the manner in which the stories are told has changed.
Well, I have to say that I'm no longer working in the field, so I'm distanced from all of that. But what I gather is that, as the French say, plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. The more things change, the more it's the same. These stories are still in circulation. It's like the blues. One of my students came, Ollie Neff, to Clarksdale from San Francisco. She read my book, Blues from the Delta, and she said, let's go to Clarksdale where this was captured and study the blues. She and her boyfriend moved there, and they did study the blues, but they discovered that there was a lot of hip hop and rap. And that's what she was drawn to as a young, aspiring folklorist. But the rap and hip hop artists that she worked with could also sing the blues and gospel. They grew up in the church as children. And so this spectrum, this evolving sound of music that gives us hip hop and rap today, those musicians are well aware of the earlier sounds that I was working with in the 60s. And the same is true with the stories, the animals' tales, the dirty dozens, the toasts. All of those are very much alive and well. And it's like an evolving, uh, if you were looking at automobiles, you have a new
Hmm.
improved model, just as you have each generation moving to what they see as a better, more contemporary sound of music, of stories, but it's built on a foundation that they are very well aware of. They all know who B.B. King is, Mahalia Jackson, Aretha Franklin. Uh, there's a tradition that goes back to the roots of
Hmm.
work chants, of fife and drum, of the ditty bow, the one strand on the wall. All of these roots musics are foundational to the sounds of music and stories that we hear today.
Looking back specifically at I Ain't Lying from a 50-year distance, is there a particular moment in the film that has stuck with you the strongest? Something that maybe you feel like reveals something essential about the essence of Black life in Mississippi?
As I've said before, that's like asking me which of my children I love the most. Uh, I think I love James Thomas and the story of the baptism. He's someone I knew for many years, and he was like a brother or a father to me. And when I hear that, it's a simple, clear vial of truth and beauty. And he tells it with such poise and clarity. I love it.
As we complete this 50 years of Ferris series on Salvation South, spanning your documentaries on blues and churches and, artistry and now storytelling. Uh, is there a thread or lesson or feeling that stands out to you the most when you look back at the impact and legacy of these films together? Like, what do you hope endures for another 50 years?
Well, what I hope endures is what has endured for these first 50, which is that people love them and they watch them. They use them in classes. They find many ways to be viewed. And that to me affirms what we thought when we made them, that this is powerful material, exciting. It teaches us about the human experience and the beauty of voices. Uh, I think that that will only grow stronger over time because they are authentic sounds of music, of stories, of crafts and art, and they will shine more and more brightly as time passes.
Well, they have certainly expanded and deepened my understanding of this region that is my home and that I love so much, as have all my encounters with you over the last decade or so. And I hope we got many more to come, you and I.
I can't wait, Chuck.
Well, mama don't lie, no guitar playing in them, big dub don't either. We don't care what your mama don't lie. We gonna play a little bit